Brazil. When we hear that name mentioned, images of colorful carnival, passionate football, rhythmic samba, vast endless beaches, and the lush sprawling Amazon rainforest spring to mind. However, behind this vibrant facade lies a truly striking paradox. Brazil is one of the world's leading nations in the sheer abundance of its natural resources. There is oil, timber, precious metals, gold, and the vast Atlantic Ocean serving as a gateway for global trade. And yet, despite all of this immense wealth, millions of Brazilians still lack the basic ability to read or write. In the most remote regions, people continue to live in tribal groups, surviving on crocodiles and even various insects. This vast and complex nation seems to exist simultaneously within the primitive 16th century and the highly advanced 21st century, all at the very same time. It successfully launches sophisticated satellites into orbit and manufactures world-class embraer jets for the global market, the do market. Yet it still faces the harsh, persistent realities of third world poverty, rampant crime, and desperate basic food or water needs for its people. So when we look at all of these deep contradictions, what exactly is Brazil?
Why is the gap between the rich and the poor in this country so vast, even when they live right next door to each other? Brazil has been called the country of the future for a century. But why hasn't that future arrived yet? To find answers to these questions, we first flew from Tashkent to Istanbul for 6 hours. This journey is truly not easy. To understand, I am currently on the longest flight of my life. Just imagine, with transfers and waiting times, it's over 27 hours. So we're ready for Varna. We're heading to our gate now, and we have a full 13.5-hour flight from Istanbul to São Paulo ahead of us. Thankfully, our friends at Turkish Airlines gave us business class seats. Otherwise, I don't know how we would have managed such a long flight.
We must first look at the map, because the history of this country begins with geography, not with people. Brazil is like an island. On one side is the Atlantic Ocean, and on the other two massive arms, the Amazon and La Plata basins. The Amazon is a swampy, tangled forest stretching for thousands of kilometers, while the La Plata is a system of massive, constantly overflowing rivers. Together they form a nearly impassable natural barrier. That is precisely why, if you look at a population density map of Brazil, you will witness something truly remarkable. Nearly 55% of the country's population lives on just 7% of Brazil's land, along the Atlantic coast. I mean, you get it, Brazil is huge, it's the 5th largest country in the world, but geography hasn't allowed the country to develop evenly. That's exactly why the nation has become divided into two poles. Along the coast, Guillaume, there are bustling modern cities with millions of people. Yet deep in the country's interior, there are tribes that have yet to encounter civilization. Now take a look at these photos. These are Brazil's most famous football players, Kaká, Neymar and Ronaldinho. Have you ever wondered why they look so different from each other? Kaká is fair-skinned and clear-complexioned, a quintessential European. Ronaldinho, on the other hand, looks like he came straight from the heart of Africa. Neymar, meanwhile, is the figure between them, with similarities to both Europe and Africa. The whole secret is hidden in history. It is possible that Brazil is the result of the most significant social experiment in all of human history. Look, you are already well aware of that. I don't usually dive that deep into history on these shows, but I have to tell you this. I'll try to explain it as simply as possible. The Portuguese first discovered the lands of Brazil in 1500. They had set out in search of new lands to the west and accidentally stumbled upon shores covered in tropical forests. At that time, no one knew that this place was almost an entire continent. While the rest of the Latin American countries were being conquered by the Spanish, Brazil became a Portuguese colony. So that is exactly why all countries in South America speak Spanish today, but Brazil speaks Portuguese. At that time, dozens of indigenous tribes lived in the territory of Brazil, but everything changed after the Europeans arrived. The Portuguese seized gold and other valuable resources, forcing the local population, the indigenous people, to work for them. However, the tribes refused to comply and began to flee toward the most remote areas. You see, the indigenous people did not want to submit to the Europeans, yet the tribes lacked the collective strength to unite and drive them out. Because if you just imagine it, the gap in their weaponry was truly massive. While the Indians were still running around with stones and sticks in their hands, the Europeans already possessed firearms. While some Indians resigned themselves to their fate and chose to work for the Portuguese, most tribes fled deeper into the country through the jungle. This led to a severe labor shortage in the aforementioned lands, which were rich in natural resources. By then, the Europeans no longer considered themselves noble aristocrats. They did not consider themselves suited for the labor on sugar or coffee plantations, in gold mines, or in construction work. That was the exact moment when the greatest transatlantic crime in all of human history was committed. In other words, Europeans brought millions of slaves from Africa across the Atlantic to Brazil to work for free under duress. It is estimated that over the 350 years of slavery, a staggering 5 million Africans were forcibly brought to Brazil to work. To put that into perspective, that is the highest number in world history. No other country received that many slaves. Wherever there are PD, wherever there are people, whether we like it or not, intermingling is bound to happen. Africans mix with Europeans, who indigenous people with Africans. It is from this process that the formula for the Brazilian nation emerges. Samba stems from African rhythms. Slaves turned pain into movement, creating capoeira. Europeans added religion, architecture, language, and literacy to Brazil. And on top of all that, there are tribes living deep in the heart of Brazil who have never learned how to read or write. Can you even imagine such a thing? That is exactly why Brazil is an absolutely unique country. I hope you now understand why I used Kaká, Neymar, and Ronaldinho as examples. So since every country has a factor that marked a turning point in its history. For example, for Arab countries it's oil, for America it's technology, for Japan it's discipline, and for Brazil, the thing that marked that turning point is this coffee.
Green gold.
Yeah. Coffee is our green gold. Yes, it is indeed.
To fully understand how a single plant changed the history of an entire country, we traveled to one of the oldest coffee farms in all of Brazil. Our local guide in Sao Paulo, a man named Adi, was there to help us explore this story.
Well, coffee here is just like vodka in Russia.
We need coffee.
It all started right here. Coffee plantations like these turned Brazil into the world's #1 coffee empire. Coffee was in essence Brazil's oil. All of Europe and America literally started their mornings with Brazilian coffee. Brazil has been the absolute leader in coffee production for nearly 200 years. 1 out of every 3 cups of coffee consumed in the world comes from beans grown in Brazil, and it is the only country in the world where coffee is grown on land equal in size to the entire territory of France. Get it? Yet, behind the billions in profit from this fragrant drink lies the immense suffering of millions of enslaved people. The treatment of those brought from Africa remains one of the darkest chapters in all of Portugal's colonial history. Before arriving here, I had clearly overestimated the harsh conditions in which these slaves were forced to live. I honestly believed the slaves would have basic living conditions, a bed or even a simple cot, but I was completely wrong. Step through this door behind me and you'll see there's nothing inside. There are no chairs and certainly no beds. They've just gathered leaves from these trees to make beds and pillows on the cold, damp ground. Do you understand what I'm trying to say here? They were treated exactly like common animals. They were treated just like wild beasts. Just take a simple barn, for instance. Even inside a barn, there is at least some form of comfort. But believe me, there is absolutely nothing left here. Yeah, they went up these stairs right here. Nothing, literally nothing. They were living like animals in this damp place, just sleeping on piles of leaves. Can you imagine? Men, women, children, it made no difference. They crammed them all into one place, kept them there, and provided the absolute bare minimum of conditions. I mean, even the food they gave them was just enough to keep them from dying. They only provided them with food to ensure they remained capable of performing their daily labor, and that was absolutely all there was to it. Coffee might smell fragrant to some, but to a slave laboring 16 hours in the scorching sun, it reeked of fear and pain. Take a look at these houses. The conditions here seem much better, but slaves never lived in them. It was the wealthy coffee barons who built these spacious, towering homes. The baron is the owner of this coffee plantation. The living conditions in their homes were considered very luxurious for that time. Fine Italian furniture, a heavy mahogany desks, and elegant European gramophones. These were the true hallmarks of the elite. Coffee turned them into wealthy millionaires, and soon they became powerful ministers, influential bankers, and prominent politicians. In those days, coffee was very currency of power in Brazil. The great cities of São Paulo and Rio de Janeiro were also built upon the wealth generated by the coffee trade.
That is precisely why it is impossible to explain the history of Brazil without talking about coffee. So much
Except freedom came to Brazil slaves later than anywhere else. Brazil was the last in the Americas to abolish slavery in 1888. Imagine, after being treated like animals, what did they have? Nothing but their freedom. They had no education, money, home, or land.
After millions of slaves were freed, they needed a place to live, so they started building shacks on the hills on the outskirts of the city, using whatever they could get their hands on. Of course, at the time, it seemed like a temporary solution, but this is the result of that decision.
So the favelas in Brazil were actually founded by African slaves, and they are places where their descendants still live today. Take a look at this footage. This isn't edited, it's real. The footage I captured myself. Look at the contrast, how stark it is. The rich and the poor are neighbors separated by a single wall. The rich are clearly very, very wealthy, with tennis courts, soccer fields, and swimming pools. You saw it yourself.
As for the poor, they are truly destitute, barely able to keep a roof over their heads.
These wealthy homes belong to descendants of Brazil's European colonizers. Colonial inequality persists. Consider half of Brazil's wealth is held by just 1%. Imagine. 1% owning half the wealth. It's the norm. While some have elevators for their cars at home, others don't even have a property title for their house.
To visit the favelas, you must get explicit permission from the gang leaders. For an outsider, it's a different story. You need authorization to enter. We aren't even talking about the complexities of filming there right now. We're just talking about the basic act of going there and walking around.
You absolutely must obtain permission before you enter a favela. Why, you might ask? It certainly isn't because of the people living there. No, 90% are just honest, hard-working people. But unfortunately, criminal gangs control the favelas. They deal in illegal drugs like cocaine and marijuana. That is their primary business. That is precisely why the real problem with entering a favela is the gangs. They are incredibly dangerous.
Let's say I go to the favela without permission. In the worst case scenario, what could they do to me?
In the absolute worst case scenario that we could possibly imagine, of course, there is a distinct chance they might decide to simply kill me. That is, at the very worst.
These guys are ordinary tourists went up Pascan. We went with a guide to Rocinha, one of Brazil's most notorious favelas. We're touring the favela. Our moto taxi guide kept reminding us, only take pictures where I tell you it's allowed. Don't take pictures anywhere else.
The favela is a world of its own. It has its own internal rules. Only those born and raised here can organize tours to this place, and even then, only with the permission of the criminal groups that control it.
Like they set up tourist spots like this at the top of the favela. They sell souvenirs and t-shirts here, and after people come to take photos, videos, and even drone footage of this view, people on the internet see it and get the impression that it must be safe to visit the favela. You get what I mean, right? Well, honestly, this is the primary business of local criminal organizations. These syndicates take a significant cut from every tourist who arrives. That is the sole reason why tourism has developed in this area. They didn't just let tourists in for no reason. The average price of a house in the favela is around $8,000 to $12,000 on Mashida. But if you want to rent one like a just imagine the monthly cost. It can be anywhere from $40 to $200. Okay? And the houses are small like this, and the rooms are very tiny, but cheap. And when it comes to the staircase, you'll find they are even smaller. You know what I mean? Whenever you step inside this house, you get the distinct impression that it was constructed using whatever random materials they could get their hands on. Basically, the walls are concrete, of course, but if you look inside, it's all very DIY, really amateurish. As you can see, when you walk into this apartment, there are only 4 chairs, 2 water bottles from the cooler. The room dimensions are really quite non-standard. Now, look, the rooms are incredibly cramped and tiny, yet every single apartment spans at least 3, 4, or even 5 stories in height. Now, these houses have no records or numbers. Simply put, they lack legal status. To get power, just run a wire from these cables to your home. Just try to understand. It really is as simple as that. If you take a moment to look up at the very tops of these tall utility poles, you will be able to see millions of individual wires all tangled up together in a chaotic mess. They're basically in a kitecho and everyone just tapped into the line, and the government provided water to the favelas, but as strange as it sounds, this water is illegal. People here don't pay for it because it was only provided to prevent an epidemic and keep people from dying of disease. That's why there's water one day and none the next. If you take a moment to look up at the rooftops, you will notice hundreds of those blue water tanks. Whenever the water supply is available, it gets collected and stored in these tanks, because otherwise there simply wouldn't be any water left for the people to use. That's why it's normal for the favela to go 3, 4, or even 5 days without water. As for gas, there are no pipelines here, so people use cylinders that they swap out and refill as needed. Its electric cables are so tightly tangled that dangerous fires break out at least 3 times a week. In other words, these old utility poles are constantly catching fire. Since houses are solid concrete, they're safe, but everything else nearby could easily go up in flames. Just take a moment and imagine that. There are 200,000 people living right here in this specific favela, and because none of these people are paying for their electricity, their water, or any of the other basic services, well, someone out there has to be paying for all of that, don't they? This situation is a heavy burden for most Brazilians. Looking at these piles, you'd assume trash isn't collected here. I'm this shit, but that's far from the truth. In fact, crews collect it daily like clockwork. What you see is just what's piled up since this morning. Imagine the scale of that. It's just another baffling, frustrating paradox of our daily lives. Look, with a Brazilian passport, you're actually able to travel to over 170 countries without needing a visa. But the real problem is, there's no money. You know exactly what I mean, right? There's just no money to go visit those other countries either. They are really hoping to find work, but they do not speak the language yet. Yeah, these are the kinds of unique medical facilities they have. These state-run medical facilities are located inside the favela and are completely free for the residents. Furthermore, the favela has its own kindergartens and schools. But the people living here, even if they have to save up, try to send their children to better schools outside the favela. Just look at the contrast.
And I am currently standing at the top of the favela, and as you can see right behind me, those red roofs belong to a private school where it costs $3,000 a month to educate your child. It is a huge contrast. You can stand in the favela and see the school, see the school, which costs $3,000 a month, along with its beautiful tennis courts and swimming pools right from your car. Rio is, in every sense of the word, a city of stark contrasts. It turns out that even though drug cartels control these areas, they have their own code of honor. For instance, you cannot touch their women and you cannot steal from people. Those who do such things face very serious consequences. Moreover, they don't sell drugs here that kamo dipumumara jikumu di yuku di lose your mind, like meth or crack, the kind that lead to theft and violence. Okay, yaku. I mean, I am certainly not trying to justify their actions. I just want to point out that they are also operating under their own specific set of internal rules. You see, you could be walking through a favela, tuck your phone into your back pocket, and I promise you not a soul would even think to touch it. But if you go to the city center, that same phone would likely be snatched from you in an instant. So in a sense, you're actually much safer when you are inside the favela, at least when it comes to the risk of theft. It is important to note that these specific rules only apply to the particular Russian favela that we have just entered. You see, every single favela operates under its own unique set of rules, primarily because it is the local gangs, rather than the government, that actually run these places. DCS. Machi the police area sees forced to simply watch everything from the outside. However, the most critical and strictest rule of all is this: absolutely no photos or videos are allowed under any circumstances.
When the guy takes you through the favela, you can only film in certain spots. Everywhere else, photos and videos are banned. Some streets are drug hubs. We just passed them. People are right there collecting cash, packing and selling drugs. Absolutely no photos or videos.
They are even forcing us to take off any glasses that can record video just to get inside. We are not allowed to have any phones or cameras in our hands either. You can't even take your glasses. You can't hold anything in your hands. I saw it with my own eyes. They have guns in their hands and slung over their backs. Right there in front of them, they are dividing money and packaging drugs. After seeing that, I understood why they demanded no filming. Because if that footage reached the police, it would make planning a raid much easier, since if you enter a favela without any intel, you are bound to get lost. Because this entire favela is built directly onto the side of a hill, the terrain here is incredibly uneven. For instance, look at where I am standing right now. There is a hill rising up behind me, but below me there is this tunnel-like area. You are actually able to venture inside of that space as well. It really feels just like a complicated winding maze. That is precisely the reason why it is so easy to hide in this place. Get it? Ananasat. A favela is a city within a city, living by its own rules. Every local business is a source of income. But they don't pay their taxes to the state, but instead to the cartel, yet the people are forced to remain silent. Everyone knows exactly why that is. Betrayal is considered an unforgivable mistake that always ends in a sudden, violent death. But the relationship isn't entirely bad. These gangs sponsor local festivals in the favela and help out low-income families. They renovate schools, kindergartens, and sports grounds. In other words, they gain the public's trust through such socially significant projects. Furthermore, cartel funds are used to sponsor artists in the funk genre. They, meanwhile, glamorize cartel life in their music videos, and in doing so, they spark an interest in a life of crime among the younger generation. Just as the boy left the favela, the streets were gridlocked. People were confused. At first, they didn't understand what was happening. We learned that 3 hours earlier, the biggest clash in Rio's history between the military and gangs had occurred. To give you an idea of the scale, these operations involved military police and special forces. So far, 64 members of criminal groups have been killed, 75 rifles have been seized, and a massive quantity of narcotics has been confiscated. This is just the information available so far. As you can see here, in the wallet, the police... according to the famous publication The Guardian, what a coincidence. I never thought I would be in Rio at a time like this. Today of all days, the bloodiest operation in the history of Rio de Janeiro took place. As a result of this major operation carried out in the Complexo da Alma and Pena favelas, a total of 132 people were killed. This includes the tragic loss of 4 police officers. The cartel members have been blocking major roads with hijacked buses, setting civilian vehicles on fire, and they have even resorted to using kamikaze drones that detonate upon impact. You really need to understand that all of this is actually happening in Rio right now. The next morning, they brought the bodies of all the deceased criminals out to the central square and laid them side by side. It is truly a haunting sight. The most interesting part is that a week before this incident, the 24-seater Mercedes Sprinter belonging to our driver Fernando, who was taking us on our group trip, had been stolen by criminals from this very favela. That is why Fernando was forced to borrow a car from his brother
Last week, my van was stolen. We were just driving along peacefully. Suddenly, 2 people on a motorcycle stopped us and pointed a revolver at us. We were terrified. They moved me and my wife to the passenger seat and dropped us off on the outskirts of the favela about 15 minutes later.
They didn't bother to take anything else. They left our phones alone and they didn't touch our wallets. But I have just lost the only vehicle I rely on to make a living.
But thank God that we are still alive today.
Nos deixaram no início de uma comunidade.
Interestingly, many cartel members don't want their children to live the same lives they do. That is why they encourage their children to focus on their studies and play football. Famous Brazilian players like Ronaldo, Ronaldinho, Rivaldo, Adriano, Romario, Dani Alves, Vinicius Jr., Rafinha, Gabriel Jesus, Thiago Silva, David Luiz, and many other well-known footballers actually came from the favelas. The government isn't tearing down the favelas out of pity for the people, but because there's nowhere else to relocate so many of them. To put it in perspective, 16 million people live in Brazil's favelas. That's more than the entire population of Portugal. But, I wouldn't want this information to give you the wrong impression. Brazil isn't as dangerous as everyone thinks. Sure, drug cartels rule the favelas, and yes, shootings do happen. You do need to be careful with your belongings on the streets, but generally speaking, if you follow safety precautions, there's almost no danger for a tourist. Honestly, some American states felt even more dangerous to me than Brazil. Brazilians have a wonderful trait. They can create a festive atmosphere anywhere. This is a truly amazing country, it just has a difficult past. As you can see, it is history that has shaped this nation's future. And there's no need to even mention the diversity within the nation. There's European blood, African blood, and even indigenous tribes living in their own communities. And the most interesting part is, that's not even all. After the abolition of slavery, the labor shortage became a pressing issue and the government had no choice but to address it. Without say, when OTAT work on the coffee, rubber and sugar plantations that built Brazil would have stalled and the economy would have collapsed. So they began promoting Brazil abroad. In Europe and Asia, they promised Brazil has vast resources and a perfect climate. Come, work and live here. They ran widespread ads were promising people they could build their dream life across the Atlantic. Soon massive waves of immigrants poured into Brazil from Italy or Germany, Lebanon, and even Japan. Imagine, this already diverse melting pot became even more so. Today, 34 million people of Italian descent live in Brazil. That is 34 million, which is 57% of all Italians currently living in Italy. Consider this specific Japanese neighborhood located right here in Sao Paulo. There are so many Japanese living here that entire districts have emerged. In fact, Brazil hosts the largest Japanese population found outside of Japan. It actually gets even crazier than that. Believe it or not, there are more Lebanese people living in Brazil than there are in Lebanon. Do you get what I'm saying? Just imagine what it would be like to have 40 million Uzbeks living in another country. You might naturally assume that because of this, there would be no issue finding halal food in Brazil. But in reality, that is simply not the case. So, the Lebanese living here have already become Brazilian. In other words, they have somewhat forgotten their identity and their roots. Furthermore, there are large Spanish, German, and even Syrian diasporas in Brazil. That is precisely why the Brazilian passport is one of the most sought after on the Aftaska black market. Are your eyes tiny or big? Is Teresa white or black? Are we Caucasoid, Mongoloid or Negroid? It makes no difference at all. It has reached a point where any face can be Brazilian. Even the famous Reuters news agency ran an article about this back in 2008. It is said that North Korean leader Kim Jong-un's father forged Brazilian passports for himself and his son to travel to Western countries. If this is true, can you imagine? In a nutshell, Brazil is the nation with the most diverse mix of blood, language, race, and culture in the world. Essentially the greatest experiment in human history.
Call me senor, still baby. She never tell me maybe when she gets a block she break me. Talking about how her daddy got figures, she ain't talk about you. Eso se trata del bambi, con la entrega. Call me senor, still baby. She never tell me maybe when she gets a block she break me. Talking about how her daddy got figures, she ain't talk about you. Eso se trata.
I didn't have a clear picture of Brazil until now. I always thought of it as just a country thousands of kilometers away on the other side of the ocean. But its history, culture, people, and the contrast there really surprised me. That's why I've tried my best to share what I've seen and learned with you. How did I do? So I'll leave it in the comments. True, our show wasn't very long this time as my filming time was limited. That's why I'd like you to take this show as an introduction to Brazil. And at the end of the show, staying true to our tradition, let's spend that money on travel instead of a fancy wedding.